Make up mine. Fight.
The Nintendo Switch was home to a lot of very solid and very mixed ports, remasters, and remakes of classic hits from Nintendo's back catalog of games. It's like the main thing the console became known for after a while, and while some people internalized it as a lack of creativity or ambition from Nintendo, I truly believe that there was a ton of merit in making a lot of these titles both portable and available to a new generation of players for the first time. And now that Nintendo has finally and begrudgingly revealed the Switch 2, it only stands to reason that we'll be seeing even more remakes and remasters now that the console's portability has been combined with presumably more powerful hardware. In this video, I want to do some classic Nintendo fan pipe dreaming and discuss my most wanted remakes for Switch 2. Noteworthy games from Nintendo's history that somehow missed the boat for the entire 8 years of the Switch 1's life. I want to stress that I'm confining this discussion mainly to first and second party Nintendo games, as if the rumors of the Switch 2 being about PS4 to PS4 Pro level in terms of power turn out to be true, then it opens the floodgates for so many games in the last 2 generations that I legitimately wouldn't know where to start. All that said though, it's time to fantasize about spending $60+ for old, easily emulated video games. Let's dive in. Would y'all believe me if I told you that I was a fan of Paper Mario for the N64? Yeah, I know, absolute shocker. For real though, Nintendo seems to be finally reanalyzing their infamously rigid stance on Mario RPGs, and specifically the Paper Mario series for the past 2 years or so, between their releases of both the new Mario and Luigi game, and especially a remake of Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door last year. And while I did play and very much enjoy the TTYD remake, my heart well and truly belongs to the game immediately before it. The decision to remake TTYD specifically over the N64 original Paper Mario game is both a totally logical and absolutely baffling decision from an outsider looking in perspective. On the one hand, it is objectively the most popular Paper Mario game, and one that was assuredly guaranteed to sell at least decently well. Yet on the other hand, it's also the second game in the series, and is pretty famously more willing to get into the weeds of some pretty serious, less brand safe material than the average Mario game. Remaking TTYD was a risk that required Nintendo to confront a lot of questions they might not have been comfortable doing otherwise, yet it ultimately is a game that I very much enjoyed and do appreciate them for making. That said, now that the foundation has been laid by remaking the objectively less quote-unquote safe game, I think they could really use a lot of the building blocks they put together here to knock out another remake of the original Paper Mario. A remake of this game has been my Nintendo pipe dream for so long that you really have no idea. It really doesn't need much fixing, but just cleaning up some of its more problem areas like the lack of a post-game, the lack of substantial challenge, the niche nature of some of its abilities and mechanics, and the entirety of Chapter 6 could really go a long way in leveling the playing field between PM64 and TTYD in terms of the best game in the series argument. It likely wouldn't even be that difficult now that the TTYD remake exists. You could pretty easily reuse a lot of the engine, graphics, and mechanical framework. Plus, aesthetically, I think that it could be really gorgeous. Imagine already pretty, yet limited by the hardware areas like Shiver Mountain, Jade Jungle, and Flower Fields, yet with the same level of visual polish and fidelity as famously pretty areas from the TTYD remake like Boggly Woods. I don't know, this first entry was kind of a layup. Paper Mario is my favorite game of all time, and I'd love to see it get the same level of respect as its much more popular younger brother. Let me save the game after fighting the final boss, please. Alright, so we just had a free entry on this list, so why don't we just make some people really angry real quick. The idea of an Earthbound remake is definitely a contentious one within the very passionate Mother fandom. Not only are there multiple dedicated fan works committed to doing that exact thing in the works as we speak, but when you've got a game that's single-handedly responsible for inspiring an entire subgenre of well-liked indie games, the question of whether or not a remake is even necessary or not tends to rear its head every once in a while. Some Earthbound fans explicitly do not want a remake of any of the games in the series because they feel that modern Nintendo filters and sensibilities wouldn't do the game's vision justice. And yeah, to an extent I understand that, but in the same breath, we've seen through the aforementioned TTYD remake that Nintendo is fully willing to release remakes that do respect the intentions and potentially non-brand safe aspects of their older games, even to the extent of uncensoring things that were softened up in the original release. Given enough respect for its legacy and vision, I could absolutely see an Earthbound remake going really hard. Now, there's obviously the question of how something like this would look, with many different fan projects taking on many different interpretations, but I'm honestly a big fan of the HD 2D approach for something like this. This isn't the first time I'll mention this type of remake in this video, but the efforts of companies like Square Enix to usher in the age of HD 2D for retro JRPG remakes really can't go overpraised as a stylish way to modernize games like this, and I feel like it's extra important for Earthbound, considering that I feel this is a distinctively 2D game. I feel like some of the charm of the game's wacky, offbeat nature would be lost with the full transition to 3D, and part of me wonders how certain aspects of it would even look. How would something like the battle backgrounds, PSI effects, or even Gygus render in 3D? Probably terrifyingly, but part of me wonders if it really does teeter a bit too close to compromising the visual identity of the original. There's also the question of if Shigesada Itoi, the creator of the Mother series, even wants to work on a remake, but considering how gung-ho he was in promoting the series' NSO releases, I'd say that question is pretty up in the air currently. Add on to that an opportunity to clean up things like the game's suffocating inventory system, or required grinding for equipment in certain areas, and I truly believe that, in the right hands, an Earthbound remake could go really hard. Okay, I'm done talking about it now, please don't kill me. And hey, while we're talking about HD 2D remakes of beloved Nintendo-adjacent JRPGs, let's stop down and talk about another layup. We all know that we're getting a remake of Pokémon Black and White eventually, right? It's like the most guaranteed thing for Switch 2, aside from people breaking the thing on purpose and then posting pictures of it on Reddit pretending it's a malfunction. And yeah, I know that we're like, in general, pretty out on the concept of Pokémon remakes at this point, especially considering the unmitigated disaster that was BDSP, but Game Freak never likes to skimp out on opportunities for free money, and if we're pretty much guaranteed to get a remake of Gen 5 at some point, I like to imagine that it'd be the best version of itself that it can possibly be when trying to sell people on new hardware. And say it with me, I think that the best version of Pokemon Black and White 2 on modern hardware would be an HD 2D remake. I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but with Game Freak or their affiliated Goon Squad consistently demonstrating themselves to be unable to deliver 3D games that impress the broader gaming scene visually, doing a really showy HD 2D version of Black and White with a similar sprite-based art style, yet just the most gorgeous environments and lighting you'd ever seen, seems almost too perfect to actually come to pass. And it's extra noteworthy here, because I feel as though out of any Pokemon game, Black and White specifically seem the most adaptable to the HD 2D mold. Things like the bridge sequence, the Ferris wheel sequence, the pinwheel forest sequence, the presence of different types of environmental lighting based on the seasons, these are all things that could well and truly be beautiful with some modern aesthetic and lighting flourishes. These are games that almost feel as though they're aspiring to this type of aesthetic in their original form. This is like such a perfect idea that it's probably the thing on this list that I'd like to see come to pass the most. Not because I prefer Black and White to some other things we've already discussed or will discuss going forward, but because it's literally right there. Look, all I'm saying is, if we get another Pokemon remake that turns out to be a divisive visual game that ends up splitting the internet down the middle, I'm punching. We've had enough logical, well-argued discussion points for this video so far, so I think it's time for some good old-fashioned self-indulgence. I love Punch Out. It's usually my chalk pick for my favorite underrated Nintendo series. Like my favorite C or D tier Nintendo franchise. Like how some people really like Star Fox or F-Zero. I have a whole retrospective going into this in the first game in the series, but to sum it up quickly, every game in the Punch Out franchise is quintessential simple Nintendo fun, with some of the most charming characters and easy to learn, hard to master gameplay I've ever had the pleasure of indulging. And while the original NES version and its SNES sequel are on Switch Online, it is absolute insanity to me that this series' most recent installment, its stellar 2009 Wii sequel, hasn't been re-released since the Wii U eShop. Like, this is just unfathomable. The Switch loves boxing games. They put Hatsune Miku and Fist of the North Star in them, for God's sakes. And yet, Nintendo just kind of forgets that they're sitting on a stellar, impeccably aged boxing sim of their own that's just waiting to be remade, or at the very least re-released. It is worth noting that there was quite recently some buzzings about a guy who knew a guy who heard a drunk guy at a bar say that this game apparently had a lot of behind-the-scenes pushback due to its regional caricatures that make up its roster, and that's why Nintendo has been resistant to re-releasing it for the better part of a decade. But I don't know if I believe that, considering that they did put the main character in Smash, that they did re-release it on the Wii U, and that they did port every other game in the series to the Switch. I don't know, there's definitely a conversation discussion to be had about how potentially aged some of Punch Out's sensibilities are, but for that to be the main thing preventing Nintendo from giving this game another shot seems like kind of a stretch to me, considering how many factors suggest the opposite. For my money, I believe that a port or remake of Punch Out Wii to the Switch 2 is another makes too much sense to actually happen kind of thing. You literally hold each controller in one of your hands and can punch independently. It is right there. It can sit right alongside fitness boxing and its associated 10 million installments. Give me another reason to beat the tar out of Glass Joe, please. Next up is an interesting one, because there's actually evidence to suggest that we may have been close to getting this for real, only to have it cruelly ripped away from us in the 11th hour. Kid Icarus Uprising. Full disclosure, this is the only game on the list that I haven't played, but that's actually part of the reason that I'd like to see it remade for Switch 2. Kid Icarus Uprising was a troubled game from the start. It had a well-regarded story and presentation style with some of the most charming writing of any mainstream Nintendo game, and it went on to be the basis for Kid Icarus's extensive representation in Smash 4 and Ultimate following Pit's reintroduction in Brawl, yet it was also always in the discussion as a game that was held back by the hardware it was released on. I never did it, but from what I understand, actually playing this game on official hardware was rough to say the least due to the control scheme that it strong-armed players into using. This was effectively a half twin-stick shooter, half-character action game that was forced to operate with only one stick, inducing a legacy's worth of wrist cramps and carpal tunnel into people who were unfortunate enough to want to play it using the stylus for camera control. From what I understand, it was well worth doing because the game was quite good, but the controls were always an enormous barrier to entry for prospective new players. Because of this, remaking the game on a console that actually has two sticks and can accommodate the type of frantic high-energy gameplay it features is a no-brainer. Sakurai himself, the director of this game, has even teased the possibility of it being remade once or twice. The thought of remaking or re-releasing this game is present in the minds of people high enough up the totem pole to make it happen. That said, as I mentioned at the top of this section, there was also recently a pretty damning headline about Bandai Namco, a company who works closely with Sakurai-led Nintendo games, having to cancel a Nintendo commissioned project just a few months ago. And while we don't have any concrete proof that it was a Kid Icarus Uprising remake, timelines and popular opinion seem to suggest it being one of the core potential candidates. I sincerely hope that this is not the case, as giving this game and its stellar writing and characters a chance to flourish on hardware that's better suited to its gameplay could easily land it in the pantheon of truly amazing Nintendo games. Some would say it's already there, but it could definitely use that slight push towards true mainstream appeal. Here's hoping Pit gets to fly again. Look, I'm autistic and have a Blue Sky account. Do you think that I didn't like Tomodachi Life growing up? This is a game that's a lot of Nintendo fans' ultimate pipe dream. If you weren't there for the height of Tomodachi Life in the mid-2010s, when every person who would go on to be non-gender conforming was posting about this game on Tumblr, and every Nintendo YouTuber realized what a goldmine it was for content, you really wouldn't understand just how important and impactful Tomodachi Life was and still is for so many people. It's Nintendo at their most weird and risk-taking. A game that people pick up not even knowing what you do in it for the first hour or two, only to become so engrossed in the me soap opera antics that they sink hundreds of hours into it. A game where you can play witness to some of the most deranged daytime TV antics playing out between any characters you can imagine through the filter of some of the most insane graphical and auditory nuances in Nintendo's history. I know people who watched every Nintendo Direct of the Switch's life hoping exclusively for a Switch port of Tomodachi and nothing else. And personally, I honestly kinda cooled on Tomodachi for Switch after a while, mainly because the Switch as a console lacked a lot of features that this game required to function, but with there being the possibility of a microphone on Switch 2, and that mysterious C button floating around, it could stand to reason that a Tomodachi remake could be much more feasible on the new hardware. Plus, there's mechanical precedent and a foundation to work off of thanks to the Switch port of Miitopia and its expansive Mii customization features. This game actually is our smoking gun that something like a Switch 2 remake of Tomodachi is possible. We were already halfway there on Switch 1. And as someone who thankfully still owns my complete in-box childhood 3DS copy of Tomodachi Life, giving a new generation of players a chance to experience the wackiness and surprising emotional depth of this game on shiny new hardware seems like just the kind of thing to make it clear just why that hardware sticks out. I'm certain it would win a lot of people that I know over, at least. Now, this last section isn't going to be for one specific game, but rather an entire series of games that I feel Nintendo has a lot of wiggle room in terms of what they could do with it. Wario Land. Now, I'm not just saying this because I own a graded physical copy of Wario Land 4, I don't know why I'm bragging so much at the end of this video, but also because this series is tight. Not unlike Tomodachi, this is peak weird Nintendo. A series with such a bonkers and deliberately unmarketable protagonist and presentation style that it's no wonder how much of an impression it left on the people who played it growing up. And boy, did it leave an impression, because despite Wario Land not having received an actual new installment since the Wii's Wario Land Shake It, it's arguably a better time than ever to be a fan of this series. Between dedicated fan successors like Pizza Tower and Anton Blast, games that take the Wario Land framework and warp it into something beyond compare using their own twisted sensibilities, the stocks of the Wario-like genre have never been higher. And Nintendo must be aware of this, as both of these games have released on Switch, with Pizza Tower specifically receiving a spotlight at a recent Indie World showcase. Nintendo knows how much people love the Wario Land series, and if they wanted to do the ultimate pro gamer move, they could absolutely remake or re-release some of these games. They could do a full Wario Land collection, re-releasing the entire series in one package. They could do a dedicated ground-up remake of Wario Land 4, the most popular game in the series. They could re-release Wario Land Shake It, a game that unfortunately didn't get much of a chance in the sun during its initial release window. They could even finally re-release the Virtual Boy Wario Land game, one of the only legitimately noteworthy games on that platform for positive reception. There are so many avenues Nintendo could take to put Wario Land back in the public spotlight, and with Wario-like stocks being sky high, there's never been a better time than Switch 2. Whether or not it's Pizza Time, Happy Hour, or Wario Time, I think we all know what Nintendo should do. And there you have it. That's the video. These are some games that I'd like to see get ported or remade to Switch 2. That was it. That's what I wanted to talk about here. If you have any ideas for this subject of your own, I'd love to hear your suggestions. Let me know why they should definitely re-release Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time again, instead of one of the games I suggested here. Either way, thanks. Hope you all had a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!